the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports.
From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports Podcast. I am Paul the Prophet Dawalibi. I'm joined today by my friend and co-host, the Honorable Judge Jimmy Baratta. For those of you who are new here, welcome to the official podcast of esports. What we do is we cover the most pressing gaming and esports topics and news of the week, but we look at all of it through a business and C-suite lens. We dissect, we analyze the business implications of everything happening in this industry. For our regular listeners, thank you guys for tuning in every week. Thank you for all the love, the 5-star ratings and reviews. We make sure to read every single review. We appreciate everyone. It's a big reason why we do the show. If you haven't yet, do me a favor, go leave a review on the podcast, wherever you listen to the podcast, and share it with a friend, with a colleague, someone who maybe works in or around the industry. It's really appreciated. It's how the podcast has continued to grow. Jimmy, how you doing this week?
What a week, Paul. I feel like we just recorded yesterday, between the holiday weekend, and happy 4th of July to all of our American listeners out there. But between the holiday weekend, the crazy busy week, and all the movement that's happening, and obviously my favorite day, which is podcast day when we record this and some of our other content, it just flew by. How's your week going? How are you holding up?
As someone who's no longer in the U.S., July 4th was just a big hassle because the banks weren't open. It was just, now U.S. holidays are an inconvenience, not something to look forward to, unfortunately. I will say, this is the I haven't been able to really play a new game in a while. And I'm starting to miss my gaming PC. You know what I mean? Like, I'm getting it to that point where I'm missing it.
I'm surprised you didn't travel.
The fortunate part, there's no new games to play. So, I mean, I guess there's a silver lining.
You're not missing anything, that's for sure. I'm surprised you don't have like a portable One of my buddies just rebuilt his rig into a pocket PC with a handle that he can travel with. It looks pretty neat. I kind of want one. But then you have to rely on hotel Wi-Fi, which might not be, the best thing. I don't know. Maybe this is the month we finally get you in on some mobile gaming, on some Diablo Immortal or what have you. But I doubt it.
Of course, I have one. I didn't say I didn't have one, and I have a gaming laptop sitting in front of me here. It's not the same, and it's not your setup. It's not your, there's a level of like, I'm me. I'm not a mobile gamer, and so like, anything less than the perfect exact setup for me feels incomplete, feels wrong. But we had this discussion on the live stream, which was fun, around, what are the new games coming out, or the lack thereof. And so I'm a little bit, definitely. I feel like I'm not feeling so bad about it as a consequence, but I am missing my gaming PC and my sim rig and all those things.
And to your point, though, new live stream for those of you that are just tuning in or haven't tuned in a while. We're trying to do it a little earlier in the day to see if that's a time that everyone likes, so we can get some more engagement, more involvement. We had great, I thought, engagement with the later show, but a lot of people that are watching this, simultaneously while working, that we said, hey, let's move this up 11:30 Pacific, 2:30 Eastern. And you know what? It's been wonderful seeing a lot of new faces that chime in that say, I never got to watch the show because it was too late at night for me, right? And now they're regulars.
Yeah, and if your boss has an issue, tell them you're working. I mean, you're doing market research. I think this is it's a very simple excuse why you need to be tuning in at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time on a Wednesday. This is like tuning into a webinar, but better.
It's a free weekly masterclass. There you go.
That's it. There you go. So speaking of masterclass, I mean, we have a guest today who could easily teach a masterclass on esports. CEO of Gen.G, none other than Arnold Hur. For those who don't know, Gen.G, one of the most prominent esports organizations on the planet. Arnold, welcome to the Business of Esports Podcast.
Well, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Arnold, for maybe the three people who listen to our podcast who don't know anything about Gen.G, because I think it is maybe one of the biggest brands in the esports world. Could you give a little bit of just your background, why you got into gaming, and a little bit of what you're focused on at Gen.G, a little bit of that story?
Yeah, sure. So Gen.G is a global esports organization. We're one of the few that are both in the Western and Eastern markets. So we have an office in Los Angeles and near in Santa Monica. And then we also have an office here in Seoul, Korea, and a satellite office over in Shanghai. And so we're really doing, kind of participating in both the esports ecosystem in North America, but also in Asia. I guess in terms of what I do, so I'm the CEO. I started out like 5 years ago when we were starting out the company as actually the chief growth officer, moved on to COO, and then transitioned to CEO late last year. My day to day is a lot of times just whatever the heck the business needs. And as you guys know, the industry is going through some rapid change and consolidation these days. So, for us, we're trying to weather the storm and try to make it through.
Arnold, you have a background that's very interesting. You spent some time at Google, for example. Like, what was the thing that maybe made you decide I really want to do this gaming thing? I want to focus my career here. Like, what was that moment, or what was that turning point?
It's funny, when I first started my career, I actually started out at Goldman in mortgage-backed securities during the middle of the financial crisis, where we're like shorting the market and the world is blowing up, and now they're making movies about my bosses. So that's where I started. I didn't really enjoy finance as much. Moved over to the Boston Consulting Group, where actually I lived in Dubai for a couple years, and did that for a couple years. Tried to do a startup of my own, which failed, unfortunately. Fell in love with tech, though, and I moved over to Google. Worked there, starting and helping launch Google Travel, which is like, when you search for like hotels, Los Angeles or something on Google, and like that box pops up. So that was a product that we helped launch and worked on. And then from there, I did another startup, an e-commerce startup, for a few years, which ended up doing well. And then I joined Gen.G when we were starting the company out of a conference room in San Francisco. The reason why I talk about that in such a long-winded way about how I got into gaming was that like I kind of got in through a roundabout way. And the funniest part about how I got introduced to Kevin Chu, who's our chairman, when he's starting this company, was I actually participated at Google in League of Legends tournaments. So all of the engineers and everybody would be playing these huge, like 300-person tournaments for League of Legends. I was on a roster, that's kind of how where it started, right? And so, you never really know when the pieces connect or the dots connect. And I was always had a passion for gaming. I've always had a passion for sports. I was always watching esports, getting excited. But one thing led to another, and here I am. So you really never know when the dots will connect, but I'm glad it did.
Very cool. Would love a little bit of like your take on the competitive positioning of Gen.G. Like, how do you see, and I'll give you some context, and people who regular listeners of the podcast get tired, I think, of hearing me say this, but I like to think of esports orgs sort of on a spectrum. And on one end, you have ultra sort of competitive. It's about winning tournaments. It's winning championships, fielding the best players, winning trophies, right? And to me, that's one extreme, and winning is the focus. And then you have sort of this other extreme, I think people have sort of settled on the term hoodie org, or, where it's more about selling hoodies, or, making a cool video out of a content house. And then you have sort of varying degrees in between these two extremes. how do you think about Gen.G, whether it's on my spectrum or do you think about that spectrum differently? But what is sort of the competitive positioning of an org like Gen.G?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know people have talked about like, oh, that's a hoodie org or something, but like, I actually don't view it that way in terms of like, I don't view it as that spectrum. I actually think, some of these orgs that people call hoodie orgs are actually ahead of their time and ahead of the industry and their line of thinking. The reason I say that is I think, you know, right now, and this could be a hot take, but the esports industry, the way it's currently constructed, is just the business model is completely broken. Doesn't work. There's not enough revenue. There's too many esports teams. I think winning alone, and we're always dedicated to winning. And we have some of the top rosters in the world. Whatever game title that we go into, um, that alone can't bring a profitable business, right? Or even a growing business. So my view is that, whether you want to sell hoodies, whether you want to make content, whether you want to do something else, launch a game or whatever the heck that you want to do, like if you stand pat trying to only win in esports, I don't think you're going to make it, right? Like the
Yeah.
esports model, the business model, as it's currently constructed, right? Like not enough digital revenue, not enough skins, not enough whatever Web3. I actually think that model is completely broken. I actually view it as the esports winter is coming. That's what I always say is that, we have whatever the number of teams that you think we have right now, I would guess that about 50% are going out of business in the next few years. So I think the industry is coming into a reality check moment. And so every esports organization that wants to survive and thrive will have to create a business line that makes sense, that's separate from esports. One signal that that's already happening. If you look on the Forbes top 10 list, look at how many teams call themselves a sports team on that top 10 list. I think it's like only like one. So the people that are at the leading edge of esports have already figured this out, have already expanded into other business lines or are expanding into other business lines as quickly as possible to survive and to be successful. So, that's kind of my view on the whole. Where are you on the spectrum? It's that like if you're not doing something different from esports as an esports org, you're going to have a really hard time making it out.
So I love this idea. And one, I love the compliment to other esports orgs and all finding creative ways. Because I know we can be critical on this show and sometimes rightfully so, but sometimes, there are defensible positions. And that's why we love having guests such as yourself that can enlighten us and share why you're making certain moves. So for you, Arnold, and for Gen.G, but more so for yourself as an individual, what are the non-esports verticals that you find particularly interesting, whether it's merchandising and licensing, content creation? Don't let me limit you, but I'm just curious, what are you looking at as far as where you want to expand some of your efforts and see, your org or other orgs, in the next 6 months to a year and a half?
Yeah, sure. So for us, education has been kind of the industry that we've expanded into and that we found a lot of success. And it naturally ties in with our more competitive focused nature and more, I would say, globally competitive focus. Global competitive focus is probably the right way. And so what we mean by education is both on two fronts, right? In the United States, we have done a lot of partnerships, whether it's with University of Kentucky, other universities, and in general, just the collegiate scene and partnering with a lot of universities to help develop their esports program and their gaming programs and do the right activations there. And then in Asia, both in China and in Korea, we've actually launched an academy. What we mean by an academy is we've got thousands of kids right now that are learning how, after school, to play League of Legends or Valorant or Overwatch better and in a team setting. So think of it as like if you play like soccer when you were a kid, or you play golf, or you want to get some lessons. Like we basically offer that to thousands of kids in Asia. And I think we also look for ways, and we have programs where we actually help these young people get opportunities within the gaming industry, whether it's there's of course a few that are able to become a pro. I think one kid went through the program. Now he's our starting support for Overwatch, for our Overwatch team, So Dynasty. But the
Well,
majority clearly, do not become pro, but are able to either get, scholarships to U.S. universities, get a career head start in gaming, or esports. And so that's kind of the program that we've been hyper focused on, that we've grown, that we felt like aligns the most with the kind of competitive and winning nature that we have. And so that's kind of where we've done most of our expansion.
Yeah, if I could follow this real briefly, Paul, down a tangent I saw, because Arnold, you had used this term global competitive focus. And I love that because, obviously Gen.G, a very large global brand that, bridges those barriers, I think, and kind of acts as a mechanism of perhaps cultural diffusion, or at least kind of sharing gaming as this unifying experience among cultures in different regions. What can you speak? You spoke a little towards education, but what can you speak towards with regard to esports being limited by geography? Certain, we could talk about, I suppose, Activision Blizzard with their kind of more regional approach to gaming versus what you see as the future, or what Gen.G is doing in that space as a global leader.
Yeah, I think esports thus far have been limited on two fronts. One is hyper regional, as in, I mean, Overwatch is an extreme example, which, there's good and bad about kind of the city and geolocation, but more in terms of the North America scene is almost in a bubble, versus the scene out in Asia, the scene out in Europe. Those are almost like completely separate scenes in terms of esports. And we've always felt like the largest esports markets are in Asia and North America, and that's why we wanted to bridge those two markets. Because if you don't have a presence in LA, if you don't have a presence in Seoul, or Shanghai rather, as well, like it's really hard to say you're at the capital of esports and where the movers and shakers and where the industry's going, and having a really keen uh, view on how the industry is evolving. So I think that's one way that esports has been limited. That's one way that we want to try to help bridge and cross those boundaries. The other is that the esports industry thus far has relied on trying to basically sell sponsorships as the only primary way to earn money and make money, which I think we're at the end of that. Like I think we're at the end of relying on pure, hey, here's a patch on a jersey, you know, um, and this is what it's worth because of this many view hours the esports team. Like that era is over, right? Like if you're playing that game as an esports org, like you're so far behind where the leading esports organizations are moving, whether it's doing on the ground activation for brands, acting as a agency that is able to activate for a brand depending on the brand's goals, moving outside of esports competitive players into kind of general gaming and lifestyle influencers. That's kind of where the juice is when it comes to the sponsorship world. But even more important, the publishers and the esports industry and the gaming industry needs to move towards digital revenue. They need to move out of telling every single esports arcade, you got to go sell sponsorships and win to have a break even. I think where we're going to head to, and we're starting to see the early signs of that, is that publishers are going to be a little bit more thoughtful, choose who their partners are, and create more of a digital skins based economy for esports and the esports ecosystem to survive and hopefully thrive. And I think that's where we're moving to in terms of the esports industry. So it's one of those things that's like really exciting, right? Like, yes, we're going through an esports winter where a lot of esports organizations won't make it out, but coming out of that, we're going to have a much more healthy ecosystem, one that actually has a real business model, um, and one where, it can actually be successful. Because I think doing more of the same as it currently exists today is a death wish.
Arnold, where's your head at on like broadcast and media rights? Like, one of the reasons why traditional sports is a little not recession proof, but a little more recession resistant is because, you have organizations like the NFL that have long term, multi-billion dollar broadcast deals that feed most of the teams, even if they're not filling stadiums, essentially, right? And so, when money's tight and people don't want to go to a game or go watch an esports match, in this case, those broadcast rights in traditional sports fill that hole. Is there a future you see with esports where that's going to happen? Or do you really think the future is more in other revenue streams?
Um, I, I'm probably more of a negative Nancy when it comes to this, but I think media rights are worth zero, right? Like, zero is probably hyperbolic, but it's not worth anything, right? There's only a couple players out there, and they're not looking to bid a lot of dollars for this stuff. So,
Well,
I
YouTube
think we're
tried,
relying.
right? With Overwatch
And
League.
you'd be surprised. YouTube Gaming's crushing it, and I think because we're in the esports bubble, we fail to recognize that, the majority of people watch YouTube, watch gaming through YouTube. YouTube Live is doing pretty well. YouTube Gaming in general is racking up so many view hours, and they don't need traditional. This is the esports book that you need to pay for to be successful, right? Like,
Yep.
with the way esports works today, it's still in growth mode, and in order for you to grow, you can't do exclusive deals. If you do, you probably won't even get paid that much because it's just not worth it for these media platforms to the way the industry's moved, right? Like, you can get more views out of one content creator than you can out of an esports league, right? So why would you pay esports league? Because the way the current media distribution channels and platforms work is, they're off of view hours, they're off of, generic display ads. It's not like high value monetization that they're doing. It's more, how can I rack up more view hours for the, millions of sponsors that I have, not sponsors, but like advertising partners that I have on a media platform, right? And so, when I see a lot of these esports leagues really banking on media rights, I think they're stuck in kind of the traditional NFL, NBA world, and that's just not going to happen for us anytime. So I'm very negative on it. I think any esports league that depends on that is just not going to work. Like, it has to be a
Yeah.
digital revenue stream. I mean, even with other leagues that have launched around events and ticketing, right from the beginning, and this was 5 years ago, I said this thing's never going to work, right? If you look at our audience,
Yeah.
if you look at the way they like to consume esports, they do not want to pay $100 to come to a match every week. Like, that's just not how this industry works, right?
Yeah.
And even to this day, like, esports and gaming, we have a lot of influence, we have a great audience, but can we really monetize that only through sponsorships? I don't think so. I think that's just a piece. And I think if you do too much in terms of the broadcast towards sponsors, you kind of lose the soul of what makes that broadcast fun. So you almost need. It's kind of obvious, right? Like, what do gamers want? Do they really want to, come to a match and buy a jersey, or do they actually just want to buy a skin? Right? What do you think is the easier
Yeah.
sell? Right? And there are the core demographic that do want to come to a match, that do want to buy the jersey, but you'd be surprised the vast majority have zero interest in paying, a ton of money to travel, to go buy a ticket and do all of that. It's just a very different culture. So, in terms of media rights, again, like I'm very negative on it. I think there's some dollars there, but it's not a lot. So I would actually be much more excited about a different economy rather than just one that's based on traditional sports.
I love the comparison to buying a skin, which not only may be easier at their fingertips, but also a more accommodating price point. I'm curious your thoughts and maybe what we can expect at Gen.G in the future. We look at the Call of Duty shop. You could look at the Halo item shop. You see some really interesting permanent or at least semi-permanent purchasable skins for different teams that are involved with those games. We saw FaZe Clan do their activation with FIFA last year. I'm curious, so again, this is maybe now a combination of merch, but digital skins and digital merch. What's your stance on, I think, those types of activations, and can we expect any of that out of you guys in the near future?
Absolutely, right. We are, as an organization, especially with kind of my view, both on the general economy, which I think we're heading into a deep recession. So I'm very negative about that. Sorry for being so negative here. But
I agree, Arnold. I agree. So I mean, you're not going to get much pushback here.
But also specifically towards esports and kind of that esports winter that I talk about. We are no longer interested in expanding into any esports title without some sort of partnership with the publisher, right? And some sort of, let's give it a shot to build a digital economy, right? I think gone are the days of this title is hot and therefore we should expand into it because that grows our audience and then we can monetize the audience only through sponsorships. Like that's over, right? Like, I'm taking a hard line and only expanding or even sometimes like cutting games that do not have that publisher partnership. And what I mean by publisher partnership is not like, the person that runs the league is super friendly and super smart. I mean, that's important as well. But is there an opportunity for us to monetize to monetize the fan base that we're able to build around esports, right? And is there a way to do it, whether it's skin shops, whether it's doing publisher partnerships around launching and advertising the game? And luckily we're getting approached by a lot of publishers even today that are interested in this specifically to work with the right esports organizations. And so I think that's where the industry's headed. It's going to be fewer esports orgs that partner with publishers, but they're going to be the ones that are able to actually monetize and build digital economies that reward esports orgs for building a fandom, right? Like I'm actually pretty negative on the franchise model because I just feel like it hinges on kind of a media rights based organization. So it's like buy a spot and sometimes just hang on for dear life and pay the minimum in salaries for, while you wait for the media check. Like that works in sports, but I think it's going to be much more pay for performance in the esports world of can you actually grow a fandom? Can you grow a community? And does that community have a way to engage within the game? With the esports orgs that are investing so much into that game, and so that's kind of where we're drawing a hard line, and I think a lot of other esports orgs will do the same.
What is the temperature in the room with the game publishers when you talk about this, Arnold? Like more like deeper partnerships and more tightly knit economics, right? Because it feels like from the outside and even with some insider knowledge that up until this point, developers have fallen sort of into two categories. Esports is a profit center and a cash grab. And, we can sell franchise slots for a lot of money. And whether it works for the teams, well, maybe. And the other bucket feels like esports is a marketing expense, right? That gets more people to download the game and buy skins. And I'm curious, if one group or the other of publishers in your mind has been more receptive to the partnership model in general, are they hesitant? Are they resistant to this idea? Because I love the way you've articulated it in terms of this being a necessary shift to make these business models sustainable. I'm just curious if the developers are on board, or is there real pushback?
Uh, Absolute pushback, right? Like if you think about the incentives and the way that they're aligned for publishers, it's like, okay, let's say I make a skin for Gen.G, right? Versus I make a skin on my own. Our colors are black and gold, so I'm assuming it's gonna be black and gold for a Gen.G skin versus just a generic black and gold skin. Today, you would make more money as a publisher doing a generic black and gold skin than you would even a FaZe Clan or a super top, been in the game for 20 years skin, right? So why should I cut a piece to an esports team instead of just making it on my own, just making something super cool? So the majority of people that buy skins buy it because they're cool, not because they're affiliated with an esports organization. That's the way the market works today. And a lot of publishers also held out hope that media rights or something else could come in and make these loss leading esports centers profitable. But
Yep.
what I think publishers have realized is that it's not going to happen, right? Like waiting on big media rights, at, hoping that esports stores can just figure it out on their own. That there was an opportunity for a cash grab and they were able to take it in terms of franchising. I think it existed for a time, but now we're coming in to the esports winter where now all of a sudden the venture money has dried up, where they're not interested in pure play esports organizations and pure play
Yep.
franchises. Like that's over, right? And so I think publishers and teams are now in a creative destruction process where they've recognized that the previous business models that they've tried don't work, that in order for them to have an esports ecosystem and a competitive ecosystem, that they need to build out this digital economy for it to work for teams. Otherwise, it's just going to die out, right? And so I
Yep.
think we're getting into that phase where they've recognized that, hey, if we don't build a digital economy, if we don't build something that can prop up all of these teams will leave, the competitive scene will dry up. You can't rely on that franchise model alone to do it for you. And I think it's actually a healthy thing for esports, right? Because
Yep.
the way the market's currently brought up is that like, hey, you love um, you love a game and you love the competitive aspect of it. Here's a car. Like you should buy this car. Like that's kind of the sponsorship model, right? It doesn't make sense, right? Like I love basketball. I want to buy a basketball shoe. It kind of makes a lot more sense, right? Or I want to buy a ticket to a basketball game. But
Yep.
I think with esports, it was kind of a bait and switch, relying so much on just on sponsorships alone, and then with media rights really not being worth as much. I think the industry is moving towards a future that's going to be much more a partnership model with publishers, and I think publishers see the value in a competitive scene, right? And the ones that are really great at it recognize that having that vibrant competitive scene is super valuable. And I think those are going to be the ones that invest more and build out more when it comes to those digital economies.
Interesting. I'm curious how you think about then, like the whole play to earn blockchain games, NFT game kind
Exactly
of ecosystem.
where I was going, Paul. Yeah.
Because it sounds a little bit like, and maybe to their detriment, they start with sort of digital economy and this kind of thinking first, and the game sometimes feels very secondary. But is it something you're looking at from an esports perspective? Is it something that you think has promise? And may supplant, call it traditional games, because of their maybe more sustainable economies?
Sure. And this is one area that is near and dear to my heart. I mean, as we talked about, like I used to work at Google. I used to when we were doing my startup, like I was learning how to code and I built, like Facebook login and a bunch of stuff that is I'm a techie at the core, right? So anything new and shiny, like I absolutely love. But at the same time, I'm also a gamer too, right?
Yep.
And the vast majority of Web3 games are complete ass. They are
I'll
bad.
correct you, Arnold. They're all of them. I don't know if there's a good one. I haven't seen a good one yet.
But what I also know when I take a step back is that if I look at the level of talent that have moved into Web3, some of the best game development talent out there in the world have now moved into Web3 and are working on their games. They're just not shouting it from the rooftops, right? So if I look at where the industry is going to go, they're going to make great games because that's literally what they've done their entire career. And the vast majority of a lot of the most talented, smart people I know have moved into Web3. So when it comes to that first problem that I talk about of will there be good games at the core instead of it's kind of like if you're launching a game and you're saying, I'm gonna make a battle pass game or I'm gonna make a gacha game, like that shouldn't be the core, right? The core needs to be I'm gonna launch a great game, and then the business model that's gonna power that could be web, could be gacha, could be mobile, could be battle passes and that stuff, right? So I think what we're gonna get to is that there's gonna be great games, free to play with Web3 components inherent in it. Will it be fair? Will it be cosmetics only? Will it be, I'll leave that up to the game publishers to decide. The way that I think about Web3 is it's kind of like being on the ground floor of the next League of Legends, except they want to give you a spot and say, look, do you want to help us build the right economy from the ground floor? Like, would I 10, 15 years ago, if somebody told me that and said, hey, you're going to be on the ground floor of developing the digital economy for League of Legends esports. If I had a seat at that table, I feel like the way the economy has been built out, the way that, the amount of skins, the amount of support that esports teams have, I think it would be radically different than what we have today. So that's kind of the way I view it, is that I have learned as much as I can about the Web3 world, obviously with our chairman, Kev Chu, and his moves in Web3. Like we're pretty involved and we understand where a lot of developments are happening. And so for me, I think it's really important that every esports organization understand how Web3 works. But at the same time, most of those experiences today are not very good. And that's why we've stayed away from, some of the other things that other people have done. Like, I don't know, like when I see some of the fan membership stuff and the way that it's executed, like it just doesn't make sense, right? Like it's like you're not creating new experiences inherently on the blockchain, and it's kind of like you can kind of do what they're saying they want to do without utilizing the blockchain at all, and like then it's like, why do you need that technology, right? And so we've been looking very earnestly and very excited about what the future can bring because there's so much development that can happen. And kind of the analogy that I always point to is like, imagine you have the internet 5 years too early before it launches, except every single Times Square billboard is talking about the internet. Of course, you're going to get the core audience being like, what the hell is this, right? Through the internet, right? And I think that's what happened, is that the marketing moved faster than the technology and what people built. And luckily, with the way the crypto markets have turned the other way, now we're going back to the builder, right? The people that are going to be building legitimate experiences because they've raised a ton of money, they have the talent, they're working on pretty bleeding edge stuff, except bleeding edge stuff takes time, especially in the gaming world. And so I think the future is still very bright. What we've seen and experienced today as it currently stands kind of sucks, especially for gamers that kind of have a core that don't care about the earning side and just want to play a great game.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, Arnold. You're not going to get the scream from me, and I've very publicly said very similar things. I think deep down, there's a nagging thing in my brain that still to this day asks the question, is it like if I told you, if I got the greatest game designer in the world, Sid Meier, right, made Civilization and Master of Orion, some of the greatest video games ever created, and I told him, make me a slot machine, right? Just because it's Sid Meier, could the slot machine be fun? Probably not, right? And so I always worry that the economics and the tokens and the NFTs and the earning is a rigid enough box that maybe the games can never be that fun or that good. And that always, I think the jury in my own mind is still out on that, but I do think it's definitely attracting a lot of talent, and that's interesting. I just had one last question before we move to our last segment, everyone's favorite news segment, and that is, you guys operating in North America and Asia, I think, is unique. It's interesting. Any lessons learned, any similarities, differences, things that have worked in one market that have not worked in the other? I think it's the kind of insight that our audience would love to hear.
One thing that's really interesting in terms of the evolution of esports in Asia versus North America is that I think in Asia, there's more of a competitive focus, right? Like if you don't clear a certain competitive bar, you basically just don't exist as an organization, especially out in Korea. But it's interesting if you think about just sports in general, right? And I always talk about this, right? And it's one of those things where I think orgs are unfairly criticized for leaning harder into the content creator side and the influencer side. Are you going to watch a Jake Paul fight, or are you going to watch a Canelo fight? The vast majority of people, especially younger folks, don't watch a Jake Paul fight, right?
Yep.
And I think that's interesting, right? When you see content creators doing better numbers than any esports, and I think, I think that's kind of where a lot of people are figuring out what to do. So one of the things that has happened, especially in North America, that I've noticed is that publishers have leaned hard into content creators and streamers, which is good, which is great. But the problem is that they've also recognized that content creators, by definition, can't and won't be loyal to just one specific title. They kind of hop around between different titles. So, I think there was it's going to be esports. Then they moved quickly over to, it's going to be content creators and streamers. And now we're kind of getting into, wait, it has to be both, right?
Yep.
Yes, there needs to be a content creator and streamer scene around your game, but you also need a core competitive side and a core competitive league, because that's going to be consistent, right? Versus content creators will move to whatever, Among Us, Fall Guys. Like there's just always going to be the next new hot thing, which is the cycle that they need to be on to be successful as a content creator, right? And so how do you combine those two instead of is it one or the other? Is, I think, a big, is one of the things where in Asia it was always like that, right? Like you kind of needed the competitive scene and you needed content creators. Versus I think in the US it was more like people were kind of hopping one versus the other, and kind of a knee-jerk ping pong type of reaction. But I think we're getting to a future that's a little bit more stable. Publishers are figuring out how they need to create an ecosystem that actually makes sense. And I think there's an onus on a lot of publishers to now recognize that, like, yeah, we got to figure this out. Otherwise, the competitive scene's going to die. The esports scene's going to die. And so I think there's much more willingness on the publisher side now to figure this out. Versus before, it was like, I just need to mention the word esports and there are people are going to throw money at me. Well, those times are done, right? And so we're just in this new phase, and I'm excited to get through it.
Very cool. I just very quickly, we do a quick segment where we get behind the scenes a little bit. Arnold, get to know you a bit better as a gamer, as a person. And so we call this the Judge Jimmy's cross-examination. We'll keep it very short because I know we're running low on time here. Just one or two quick questions. Judge Jimmy, take it away.
All right. I think I know the answer to this first one, Arnold, given your comments about playing League over at Google. But what is your favorite video game, either right now or of all time?
Ooh, I would say my all-time probably League, just because that's kind of how I was able to launch and have a career in esports. Even though I was a Shaco one trick It still led me to getting on a team at Google and getting everything started. These days, I still the only game that I play though competitively is Overwatch, and I've been kind of waiting until Overwatch 2 to kind of reboot that. The funny thing is, like, I joined the esports because I love gaming, but the reality is, like, I have no time. So I'm pretty terrible at every single game that I play when I just have enough time to be good. So historically, I would say my favorite game was League. These days, I'm waiting for Overwatch to play competitive. Those are probably two of my favorite games that I've played.
We'll have to have you back on after Overwatch 2 drops and get your early thoughts, but two great answers. We'll keep this short, I suppose, and do one more new question for you, Arnold, that we haven't asked other guests before. Just a lot of your conversation was leading us to the metaverse type of conversation, and I want to get your take. So just quick temperature read on the future of the metaverse, whatever that means to you, whatever that looks like with regard to social environments and connectivity. Are you a big fan? Are you really excited? Are you on the fence? Is it something you don't put a lot of stock into? Where do you land with regard to what you think the metaverse will be?
I think there's gonna be so many great games at launch, but they're not gonna launch this year. I think you're gonna start seeing some really amazing games launch starting next year. I think you're gonna start seeing some early alphas at the end of this year. Just the pipeline of games that will be launching will be tremendous, just because the talent that's creating great games will be tremendous. And so the way I think about it is, for the first time, if you're a Sid Meier, but a young Sid Meier, you have access to capital to fund your game very early, and the amount of capital that's out there to be able to fund the next generation of talent, just and to solve some of these problems around, hey, how can you not have a pay to win economy where a competitive game where you just pay to win everything instead, and how can you create something where there's a reward for being just really amazing at that game, right? And I think that's what's going to happen. I think that's going to be a game changing thing that comes through, and I'm super excited to see it. And I think more and more esports organizations, publishers, behind the scenes, when I talk to every single leader at publishers, at esports org, they're super excited. They want to go all in. Publicly, they can't say anything because they're worried about the backlash. And I think a lot of the problems that currently exist are real. And the way, the reason why fans are angry and hate everything with Web3, I think they're for real, valid reasons. And the different part of the view that I have is that those valid reasons that people, don't like, the smartest minds in the world are working today to fix those core problems. And anytime you have people that are this intelligent, this smart, and with this much capital, I assume that they're going to be able to fix those problems.
I think I opened the door on another episode there, so I appreciate the elaborate thought behind the question, Arnold. Last one, I promise. Favorite gaming snack? What are you eating when you're playing Overwatch? When you're eating League? And I promise we'll let you go.
So I'm 37 now, so I try to be healthier. So I want to say sparkling water is all I'll snack on. But if I have my cheat day, I'll be eating hot Cheetos nonstop, even though it crushes the keyboard and the mouse. But like, you just can't. Hot Cheetos are so good.
They're too addicting. Awesome, Arnold. Thanks so much for coming on. I'm giving you back to Paul, but I'll see you soon.
Arnold, if for people who want to follow what you guys are doing, or you personally, how can they find you, or how do you want to be found or followed?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter. I mean, our esports org is GenG, GenG. And then you can find me as well, Arnold WH on Twitter. So please follow me, smash that subscribe button or whatever it is. Happy to always engage and talk about this stuff anytime. Thank you for having me on the show.
I mean, Arnold, congrats on all the success of Gen.G. Amazing story, and I love the candor and sort of the real take on what's going on in esports. And I think you guys are just doing it smarter than just about anyone else. So someone to follow for our listeners, absolutely, and follow what Gen.G's doing, because I think it's the model. Just a couple quick reminders. Make sure to follow Business of Esports everywhere on Instagram, on Twitter, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, you name it. Subscribe to our brother and sister podcast, Meta Business, Meta Woman. So much great metaverse and Web3 content coming out of those podcasts. And don't forget the absolute most important thing: the future is fun. We'll see you guys next week.